right, so we're here on Ponte Umberto in Rome. This is one of the most famous overlooks and best photographs you can get in Rome. And just off to my right here, past the bridge, is the beautiful Ponte St. Angelo. That's the Bridge of Angels. And to the right, you can also see all three domes of the Vatican. So this shot's really interesting because we're on a bridge, which is really great because it works perfectly for sunset. Since we're positioned right on the stone balustrade here, we can shoot and nobody can get in front of us. It's really, really nice and convenient because we just have a waterway to work with here. So in addition to the big tripod here, I also have my TFA01 with a small BH20 ball head on it. That's going to play as my second camera here, and it's going to be set into portrait or vertical orientation. So this camera here is going to be set up for my traditional blend. We're going to be blending a sunset with a blue hour tonight. And this camera is going to be my play camera. Since this camera has to stay still the entire time of shooting, this is the one where I'm going to experiment with different compositions and hopefully nail an additional vertical shot as well. Now, whenever possible, I like to shoot a horizontal version and a vertical version because you never know what people are going to need. For example, if it's a magazine cover or an article like that, a lot of people are going to ask you for a vertical version of your image. So rather than cropping a horizontal version, if they see a vertical version that fits the format they're looking for, they're more likely to purchase the image. To talk a little bit about my setup here, I've picked this specific position on the bridge, plus or minus maybe 10 feet on either side. And the reason is, if we look at the sample image here, you can see how the composition on the left side, the bridge actually leads right into the Vatican before everything disappears into the trees. I've taken two more example shots. Here's a shot a little bit to the right of my position. And as you can see with this image a little bit to the right, I'm starting to cover up the Vatican with the trees. Now, obviously we don't want to do that because the Vatican is pretty much the most important subject in this photograph. It really makes up the core of the subject. Now, the next one I want to show you is me positioned a little bit to the left. Now, a little bit to the left doesn't destroy the photo, but it also moves the Vatican dome to the left. So the Vatican isn't really the last object that terminates into the trees anymore. We have some extra buildings to the right that don't really need to be there. So the position I chose is the one that I feel has the strongest composition. It leads from the left to the right into the Vatican, which is the most important subject, and then gets lost in the trees, which is really nice. Another thing that I've done is I've framed much more sky than I've done water. Now, if this sky turns into some brilliant colors like I'm hoping it's going to, I'm going to be really happy that I have all that extra sky to work with. The water will reflect some of that sky, but really I just want to concentrate on having some of the basic reflections of the Vatican. So as long as I'm not cropping the tip of the dome reflecting in the water, I'm pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and frame mostly sky. Now, up until this point, I've also been using my 14-24 lens or my 16-35. But with this example, I'm going to show you what it looks like shot at 35mm. So here's 35mm. It's way too wide. There is so much dead space in the foreground of this river and whatever that collapsed little barge thing is to the left. While it's interesting and it makes an okay photo, it's really not isolating the subject like I want to. So for this photo, I'm using my 24-70 lens zoomed all the way to 70mm, which I feel is a really nice composition to frame this subject. Now the second camera, the Fuji X-E2, has the 55-200 attached. That's the camera I'm going to use to zoom in even more to get some nice tight detail shots as the light starts to progress. This gives me really nice options to shoot the composition that I want at 70mm while also picking up a few more compositions that I might want later, a little bit tighter or even a little bit wider if I decide to. So we've talked a little bit about the setup here and how we're trying to combine a brilliant sunset, all those colors with the blue hour like we've done a little bit before. This shot really sings when it's in perfect harmony with just brilliant colors of a sky and a late blue hour when all those lights are on in the Vatican and the bridge and the different buildings back there. Now these clouds are really interesting. When I got here about 45 minutes ago, there were a little bit more variations in the color, but right now they've gotten really thick and black. They actually look like they're going to turn into rain clouds. So this could actually be really, really nice when the sun sets, or it can be an absolute failure, in which case I'll have to come out here again and try this shot one more time to try to get exactly the right conditions. Now, as I said before, this is a very iconic shot in Rome. It might be the most iconic shot in Rome, and I've been shooting from this position for the last few years. In fact, it's one of my favorite places to just come and casually shoot if I don't have anywhere else to go for sunset while I'm in Rome. So let's take a look at two examples of some of the really nice sunsets I've had. So this one's from 2 years ago. It's zoomed in a little bit tighter than I have framed at 70 millimeters now. And you can see that the sky just exploded in orange colors. It's just a mess of color and texture, and I love it. And actually, it was my favorite shot in my portfolio for a really long time until I recently captured this shot. This photo is also shot at 70 millimeter, but it has this crazy vortex sky. Now, believe it or not, this color that you see in the sky is almost all straight out of camera. All I did was a slight white balance adjustment to bring out the reds just a little bit more. But in all my years shooting Rome, that was the most amazing sky I've ever seen. It was so amazing that I heard people talk about it on the news the next day, how amazing the sunset in Rome was the night before. Now, both of these shots have one big thing in common. They're blends of an incredible sunset and a beautiful blue hour, both of them together. And that's exactly what I'm going to try to do tonight. But with these clouds, you never know what you're going to get. It could be magnificent or it could be an absolute dud. Now, I'm hoping for obviously the magnificent side of this, but you never know what's going to happen. Now, about an hour ago, we set up a GoPro time lapse so you guys can see just how these clouds have progressed over time. And through that time, you can see how they've gotten thicker and darker, like they're gonna rain. Now, we're here in Rome right now in the extreme off season in the winter, so even in peak times of the day, it's still gonna be much less crowded than it is, say, in the summer at the peak of their season. But this being a very popular location for photographs, there's gonna be a lot of people lining up along this bridge. That's why it's really nice to condense the imprint of your tripod as much as possible to prevent people from tripping over it or knocking anything or jarring your shot while you're working, and also being polite to give enough people space so that they can set up their shots comfortably as well. So you have to sort of manage your space here, and if it is a very busy time of year, the best thing you can do is get here an hour to an hour and a half early to make sure that you can stake out the exact shot that you want with the composition that you want so that everybody doesn't take it by the time you get there. That's very important. Another thing I want to address is the importance of keeping your gear safe in an urban environment. You always want to make sure everything's within eye shot, and if you have a bag, make sure it's sort of tucked in front of you. You don't want to leave any bags open or off to the side and out of sight, just in case there's people around who might take your gear. So make sure to just keep an eye on everything, and safety is the key to make sure you'll never lose a thing. So at this point, there's nothing really new that we're doing in this scene. I'm going to be capturing exposure brackets, whether it's going to be 3 or 5, depends on the amount of light in the sky. Right now it's really flat, so I could get away with 3. Now, I've been shooting here for years, and out of dozens of attempts, those 2 photos are the best and most amazing skies I've ever gotten. So at this point, it's just a waiting game, and we can be here for 5 days and still not get what we want, or we can get here on day 1 and get something amazing. It's just all down to luck once you've used the skill to put yourself in the right place. So the key to this image in particular is blending a sunset and a blue hour together. So it has to be an extraordinary sunset where the sky lights up with great colors, and it also has to be a late enough blue hour where we can start registering all of the lights on the bridge, the buildings, and the Vatican. As the blue hour progresses into a late blue hour, that also means we're going to get those same colors and lights reflected in the water. So that's the right frame we want to use with the blue hour, and then we want to combine the sky from the sunset with that frame and merge it together. The reason you can't do this in one shot is because by the time all of the lights turn on in the city and everything's reflecting perfectly, all of the light in the sky will already be gone. So obviously, this much intense blending is going to require some really clever post-processing. We're going to have to adjust each of the frames so that they blend seamlessly, and you can't tell that it was 2 different moments in time. The goal is to have the viewer believe that nothing's out of place, that the blue hour shot doesn't have too many harsh shadows because it's dark, and that the sunset isn't too bright on the buildings. So I've been here for a little while now, and based on my experience with this location, I can tell that the sky is not going to live up to my expectations today. I'm going to be in Rome for another week, so I'm going to try a few more times to get the conditions I really want for this shot. But when I do come back here, I'm going to use the exact same position with the exact same settings, so don't feel like you're going to miss out at all in the instruction. So tonight, something really strange happened. The lights on the Vatican never turned on. The Vatican lights are always on. In fact, they usually come on first. It's the beautiful lights of the dome of St. Peter's. But now it's completely dark except for 3 little funny lights in one of the windows. So everybody here who's been waiting to get this shot is now either asking each other why those lights aren't coming on or very disappointed because they didn't get their nice blue hour night shot. At this point, I'd be surprised if they come on at all, but even if they did, blue hour's over, it's full dark, it's not even gonna be a really good shot. But these are the kind of situations that you can never plan for. In Italy, this happens a lot. Sometimes lights don't come on schedule, or they're broken, or things are under maintenance, there's scaffolding. There's any number of things that can cause you to not get your shot. So it's always good to exercise both patience and flexibility. And when this kind of stuff happens, you shouldn't be disappointed. You should just be happy that you're in this beautiful spot, in the beautiful part of the world, and enjoying these incredible scenes. So don't let it get you down too much if you don't get the shot that you want. Just enjoy the moment, because you can always come back here again and try again later. For the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to make sure that I come out here again and again, try to get that key shot that I wanted with the perfect sky, the perfect blue hour, and of course, the Vatican lights coming on. Welcome back to the studio, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the shot that I got from Ponte Umberto in Rome. If you remember, that's where we shot the bridge, Ponte San Angelo, the Bridge of Angels, with the Vatican dome behind it. It's a really awesome spot for photography, but remember when we were in the field, I had said that I would have multiple attempts. I'd try multiple times to be able to get the right sky, the right conditions, so we'd have something really fun to work on. Well, the first 2 attempts didn't work out. The third one didn't work out, but on the 4th attempt that I had in Rome in that week, the sky looked beautiful. Actually, it was an amazing sunset, perfect blue hour, but the Vatican dome didn't turn on. Now, just a little backstory on the Vatican dome. I did find out that the reason the dome was off for the entire time I was there is during the off season, they decided to change all the lights to LED lights, which is really cool. In between then and now, I actually went back to Rome, and I have to say the lights are even nicer. So they're even more vivid, bright, and apparently the LED is going to cut power consumption in the Vatican. So they are now very power conscious, which is kind of cool. So either way, it took 4 attempts to be able to get the right files to work on, but that's pretty typical with this type of photography. You really have to wait for the perfect conditions to be able to get the shot that you want. So you also saw that we were trying, multiple compositions. We showed you multiple compositions. We showed you a vertical shot versus a horizontal shot. The shot that I'm about to show you is actually shot with the Fujifilm X-T1, and it's using that same little tabletop TFA01 tripod just on the balustrade of the bridge. So it's pretty cool. It's super stable. I was able to get the shot that I wanted with the Fuji X-T1. This is going to be another time where we're blending time together. We're blending moments of time. We are going to take the peak of that beautiful sunset, blend it with a late blue hour. So usually I would try to pick something that was a little closer together in time. So if you think about blending black and white together, it's easier to blend shades of gray because they're closer to the same. So the farther you reach out in time, the farther you take a daytime shot into a nighttime shot, the harder it is going to be to blend together. So the idea is, no matter what you do, whether they're close to time or far out in time, is to try to find a way where you can bring those values back together, similar to how we've been doing things this whole time with making sure that our blending points match. So for blending highlights in, make sure the shadows sort of match so that any overlap with our highlights on the scene below will blend in the shadows. So we're going to be doing similar things here, but we're also going to be blending this awesome sunset with this blue hour. So it's going to get a little bit more complex in the layering than we've done so far, but I'm going to break it down in a simple process that you guys can understand. So let's get started. Here we are back in Capture One. Remember, this is a Fujifilm X-T1 files. These are RAF files. 16 megapixel, super high quality, but I wanted to show you guys again, the camera takes care of the distortion. Now, these are shot at, it looks like I shot these at f8, and you can see even if I change the light fall off, the camera gets rid of the vignetting, gets rid of the distortion. So just make sure that it doesn't remove the distortion because it'll actually distort it instead. I know I mentioned that a couple times, just wanted to send that point home so we never have distorted Fujifilm files. Here's what we shot. I shot the best of the sunsets. You can see we have pinks, all sorts of hues of blue, oranges, gorgeous sky, really flat in the foreground. You can see the lights are just starting to turn on here. We waited a long time between these shots, but you can see here is the last blue hour shot that I captured. So right now it's really dark. We're going to have to do a little bit of work on the shadows to bring it up, to somehow get it to match into the scene. So best case scenario, we're going to end up with a sky similar to this, though not as blown out, with a blue hour that's similar to this. But we're also going to have a unique issue too that we're going to have to solve in post, which I'll walk you through the process. Is right now, look at the sky here, the blue reflects blue in the water. It's natural, it's the way a reflection works. Take a look at the sunset. We get those colors reflecting. So we're going to have to find a blending point between the colors in the water and the colors in the sky and the lights reflecting as well. So it's going to be a little complex, but we're going to start simply. The first thing that I like to do, I don't just want to take one file and blend it into the other one. This may seem interesting, but right now we have a fairly high dynamic range scene, meaning that there's a lot of light, and I need 2 exposures to be able to blend this seamlessly. The way I like to think about this type of blending is that I first want to blend these shots together. So I want to create a perfect lit blended sunset before I actually blend in the blue hour. So in this case, we're going to create 2 blending states. One blending state for sunset, one blending state for blue hour. So the first thing we have to do, I like to start at the bottom of the base and then build up. So I'm going to say that the sunset is going to become the base of this composition, and then I'm going to blend in the lights from the blue hour. So the first thing that I want to do is address the compositing we need to do for the base. So let's start with the neutral exposure. This one, the sky looks really nice, but it's really dark. You can see we have clamp levels. The one here, the neutral exposure, you can see that we're not losing any of the blacks. We're not really losing any of the whites either, but it does look a little bright. And then here, this one's a little bit blown out, but we're starting to see the details in the shadows. So what we're going to do is combine this one for the base for the shadows and this one for the highlights. So the first thing I want to do is address the issues in this one. And really what I'm going to focus on for this one is getting that perfect balance for the sky. So let's try to recover some of the highlights first. Let's pull this up. Let's pull it up really far and see what happens. Let's also bring the shadows up so we can recover some of that. Let's go all the way up to about 60. That looks pretty good. Now, I'm still having some issues with the sky. I feel it's a little bit blown out. So what I'm going to do is pull the whole exposure down just a little bit. We'll try to make it around 0.03. And now here's where I can do my adjustments. I can basically pull the shadows, pull the highlights. And what I'm really trying to do is, I like this hotspot here, but basically I want to be able to control that in Photoshop later, add a little bit more vibrance before I start to pick those values back up. So we'll just pick something right around here. Well, that looks pretty good. Now, if this was going to be our base, the next thing we need to do is adjust what's going to be our shadows. So right now the highlights look really good, shadows are still a little bit dark, and I've underexposed a little bit to be able to get the sky the way that I want it, and I can't recover too much more in the shadows or else it's going to start to look a little bit gray. So I'm going to go up to the next exposure now and make adjustments. First things first, let's go ahead and bring up the shadows to the way that we want the shadows. And in this case, I think that's pretty good luminosity for the shadows. Next thing I'm going to do is I want to blend the shadows into here. So what I'm going to do is try to recover some of the highlights. Now the idea is that I'm not going to be using any highlights from this layer, but anywhere that it blends over, or any of the masking that I don't do correctly, even though we're going to be doing it all correctly, I want to make sure that these edges always line up. So let's go ahead and bring this shadow up a little bit to match, so maybe somewhere around 80 as well, and then we'll use the shadows from this layer. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is bring this layer into Photoshop. I'm going to export the variant so that we can pick this up into Photoshop. And you guys remember, I always copy it out of one document and then paste it in. This time, I've already brought in the original raw into the PSD so that we can start keeping this organized, and we can call this adjusted raw shadows. Or actually, this is going to be highlights. Next thing I'll do, go back to Capture One and export the next layer. Perfect. Let's go ahead and bring this in as well. Adjusted raw, shadows. Good to stay organized from start to finish. Now that we have both these layers in, we have our highlights layer and we have our shadows layer, what I want to do is create a custom luminosity mask to blend these things together. So the first thing I'm going to do is toggle the top layer off, which is our adjusted one, leave this one visible so that when I go to channels, it's going to show everything here. So basically what I'm going to do is select the RGB channel. We've done this before. We need to create a mask just for the shadows. I'm going to go down here, I'm going to click on the Create New Mask button, and what I'm going to get is a mask for the highlights. But you guys remember, if we Command I on the keyboard, that will invert it into a shadow mask. But here's what's happening. Right now, I'm still selecting a lot of the sky. I want to get rid of as much of those clouds as possible because I want to use the sky from the base layer, and I just want to use this foreground. So what I'm going to do is something called clamping. I'm going to clamp these levels by loading curves. And you can always go up to curves by saying Image, Adjustment, Curves. Or you can use the hotkey, Command M, M for curves. I'm not sure where they came up with that hotkey, but that's how it is. Command M here will bring it up. And what I'm going to actually do is bring the dark values down while trying to bring the white values up. And I do that just by clamping this, just like we add contrast. Basically, by dragging this down, this is going to start clamping these levels down. And I'm going to start removing some of the sky. And really what I'm trying to do is pull some of this away from the edges. At the same time, I'm going to go ahead and clamp this so that a little bit more becomes white, and I'm just going to make some minor adjustments here. So far that looks pretty good. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave all this intact in the bottom, but I want to adjust just the sky. So I'm going to grab the marquee tool by pressing M on the keyboard, and I'm going to just make a selection right about here. I'm going to do another Command M for curves, and I'm going to clamp these down just a little bit more, just a hair. Now that they're clamped down really well, I have nice separation from all my edges. I can say OK, Command D for deselect, and I'm basically just going to lasso out some of the stuff that I don't need. Bear in mind you can paint this too, but for me, I'm using the Wacom Intuos and the stylus, so it's really easy to freehand this. I'll flood it with black, and we'll get rid of that area right there. So basically what this is going to become, it's going to become our mask just for the shadows. So I'll go ahead and load it, turn RGB back on just so we can see everything again. I'll create a folder, and I'll apply this to the folder, and we'll just call this Shadow Luma Mask. And I'll put our shadows inside of this folder, and basically what we get is from here to here. What's really cool though is we're not affecting the sky whatsoever. We've made sure to not affect the sky, just the foreground. So we made that foreground even brighter. And it actually looks good. These edges are all intact. The other nice thing about doing it this way is that we don't end up with any seams. Everything looks pretty good. Even when we blend the water, these are shot so close together that we're not getting any of those negative effects of stack up or areas where the water starts to move a little bit. What we can do if we are starting to get those areas, like right here, if we look, we can just go in with the brush and we can paint white in these areas. So just so that we don't have any overlap, any extra ripples. Think about if you shoot 3 different exposures, blend them all together with some sort of opacity. Obviously the ripples are going to stack up too, which is what we don't want. So what we can do is just go ahead and paint this in. And I'm just going to paint those ripples right back in just with white, just so we don't have any problems there. Also bear in mind that some of this is going to get covered up once I bring in the blue hour shot. But what I want to do first is I want to create a seamless composite as if this was going to be our final image. Imagine if this wasn't going to be a blend, it was just going to be the sunset. I want to make sure that the base underneath looks just as good as what it's going to get flooded with. That way, anything that causes an overlap where there's some edges or something that doesn't fade in correctly, I know that everything underneath those masks that I create are going to be perfect as well. So basically what this does is it creates what's called our sunset blend. So we've done one blend so far. The next step is to start working on the blue hour. Before I do that, I'm going to take these 2 things together, create another folder just by dragging them to the folder, and we're going to call this sunset blend. Now I'm going to go back to Capture One. We're going to start working on the blue hour. Here in Capture One, I've already highlighted these green for myself for easy reference. Basically what I want to do is use this file here because this one is way blown out. Nice in the brightness and the shadows, but the highlights are just too destroyed. Even in this one here, if I go and show my highlight warning, you can see I'm losing some stuff. Even though this looks blown out in the castle, it's not, but visually it is. And visually can be just as big of a problem as actually blown out or 100% blown out. So we have to be really careful. Roll down to the negative exposure, however, and we can see that this looks pretty good. We still have some blown out areas here in the water, but it should be easy to adjust. So basically what I'm going to do first is this is going to become my base. Now again, let's pretend that we're not going to blend this into the sunset. We're just going to work on a blue hour. This would become the base, and after we get this one ready, the next thing we're going to do is blend in highlights to correct anything that's overexposed in the base. So let's go ahead and make our adjustments to this file first. The first thing I'm going to have to do is obviously pull some of those highlights back. Don't worry about the sky too much, so we'll just go ahead and change that. Next thing, obviously, if we look at the shadows from this layer, much brighter than this. So we're going to have to adjust the shadows as well. Let's just pull those up a little bit and make it just something like that. And that's already starting to look like a really good blue hour shot. We're just going to have to address the lighting. So after this is done, let's take a look at the next exposure. Here we go. This is very underexposed. So let's see what we can do. If we pull it all the way up and all the way up for the highlights. Well, it doesn't look that good. It's a little washed out. This one, you can actually see some more of the detail. This one becomes a little bit more washed out. So we're going to go ahead and pull the exposure down a little bit too. I think that looks right on the money. So here's basically what's going to happen. We have our base layer, and then we have our highlights layer. And again, if I look at this, you can see that we only have some things that are overexposed, none of the sky, and then here you can see it's starting to grow. So basically, I want to get rid of as much of the highlight overexposure as possible and use it as a blending point. So looking at a reference, let's pull this down just a little bit more, underexpose it just a hair, and by a hair I mean really 0.05%. I know that may seem like not much, but it actually is. Let's go ahead and export this in. Combine it on top, and then we have our adjusted raw for, we'll say, shadows this time. Let's go back into Capture One, or remove the annoying notification that it always gives us, and we'll export this one too. Perfect. Let's bring this in as well, and put this right on top. Okay, so basically what we're going to do now is go back into the channels. We've already created our mask, but you can see we've clamped it to death. So we're going to have to create a new one. I'm going to go ahead and create a new one for this, and I'm just going to load the RGB. Instead of creating a new channel here, because that's a little bit wasteful, I'm not going to need it, I'm just going to go ahead and apply it to a folder. That way we can take a look at it. If you hold Option key and click the mask, you'll be able to see it, and you can see it's already set to be the highlights. If I want to, I can clamp this as well. I can just go ahead and pull these values down so I know there won't be too much overflow. But you know what? I'm going to leave it pretty much as is without making any adjustments, and I'm going to go ahead and put these highlights in, and we're just going to take a look at a before and after. You're going to see that you're not going to see too much difference except for where the sky and the water overlap. What we're going to do here is a selective replacement. I'm going to create a mask on here, and just in the areas that I want to fix. Since I have this mask as a controller, I'm going to have a new mask on this layer so that I can go ahead and brush in very simply using a flow. I'm just going to pick 30 here. You can see that I can go ahead and brush in these lights. You'll see these lights get smaller and a little less exposed around here, this window. Anything that I feel is overexposed, especially around this castle here, I just want to go ahead and blend it in. As I start to turn this on and off, you'll see that this will now be more correctly exposed. Well, thankfully, these cameras pick up a lot of dynamic range, so you won't have to do much, but see how this light is really blown out really big? With the underexposed one, I can actually pull it in. It makes the blown out portion of the light itself a lot less intense. All these areas here, between the tree, all of this stuff, all of these little things, I'm just going to go in and fix. I don't really want this to be overexposed back here. I want to be very careful that none of it is. So we'll go ahead and pull the exposure down here, pull it all down here, and just be very careful. Sometimes we'll get weird paint artifacts, so if you get any of those, just go ahead and black them out. Don't paint them in. It's pretty easy. Again, you can do this with a selection tool. I already did the sky with a selection tool, but this, for some reason, this kind of stuff is just easier to paint. Probably because you get a softer edge. Here's where it also gets fun. See these areas here? I want to go ahead and fix these areas of highlight. I'm going to use a very light-handed brush, very soft brush. And I'm just going to softly brush in these pieces. So I just want to go ahead and make sure they're okay. If you get things that are happening here, I'll take a look. I'm going to go ahead and brush that out. Any parts that look strange, be very careful. Sometimes if you just want to correct for the highlights, you have to be very soft with the brush, especially down in these areas here. You just want to fix the highlights. You don't want to mess with anything that's around these areas. Especially this one here. That one is way too bright. Bringing in the underexposed layer, basically just pulls its imprint down, makes it less predominantly blown out. Very easy. This is the Fujifilm X-T1. I was shooting 3 exposures, so that's a -1. You can see that if I wanted to get this down even more, I'd need a -2, so I would have wanted to bracket 5. The Nikon does 5. Currently with the firmware of the Fuji X-T1 only does 3, so you have to do the other set manually if it's something that you really want. For this case, it'll work fine though. So we'll go ahead and back this out. That looks pretty good. So far, so good. Let's just take a look before and after. May seem small, but now we have no blown out values. So we blended these things together here. We're just going to make this, keep the naming consistent. This is going to be highlights Luma mask. That's cool. We're going to select both of these and we're going to say blue hour blend. So here's where it starts to get really fun. We've essentially just created 2 different scenes. We've created a sunset scene. Of course, it needs more post-processing. We've created a blue hour scene, and of course, that could use more color tweaking and everything. But how do we get them together? Well, that's the really fun part. There's so many different ways to do this. We could do it with masking. We could do it with a selection tool. We could actually go in and paint around these edges to try to get everything in. But I want to use a really simple method. So remember how we just clamped a mask earlier on? We clamped the blacks to get it to be more constricted to a solid selection. We're going to do the same thing, but we're going to do it a slightly different way. Something I want to point out really quick before we do that, in the channels, the more that you clamp channels, the more you clamp edges, I just want to show you guys, if I bring up a curves again, the more that I pull these blacks, the more it'll start to destroy the edges. It'll eat away at them until the point where, this is extreme example obviously, but you'll start to see the pixel level. So you have to be careful. It has to be a push and a pull and literally a give and a take. We don't want to overdo it because we don't want to destroy the edges. So the nice thing is, if you need to pull a very complex mask, if you do it in the channels, that's not as good as doing it in camera raw. So there's sometimes, and this doesn't work all the time, there's sometimes that in camera raw we can go ahead and generate something that we can create a better mask out of. Now let's really think about what we're trying to do here. We want either this area all to be black, and in this case it's the darkest. If this was all black here, and the sky was all white, that would be an easy way to generate a mask. Well, this sky's not going to work. Look at that dark patch. It's a lot of dark there. So what if I went back to this? Well, now we're talking. Look at all that light. Light, 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 light around dark. What happens if I go to the underexposure? Check out now. We almost have this as black. So let's see if there's any way that we can go ahead and compress these values here to try to generate something that's going to be easier to channel mask. And that's really what we're trying to do, is create a channel mask for that. All right, so let's see what we can do. First thing I want to do is pull the exposure up. I'm trying to blow out that sky. All right. That looks absolutely crazy. So let's go ahead and do more. Let's blow out more of that sky. That's actually pretty awesome. And you can see how blowing out that sky has actually left these dark areas intact. So I almost have a selection here, though it looks completely blown out. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this into Photoshop and I'm going to take it a step further. So let's export this as a variant. All right, let's bring this into our document. I'll go ahead and save right now as I do this as well. It's a good practice to always keep saving. And paste this in. Oops, that's a problem. If that doesn't happen, if you do the Command-All, Command-Copy, Command-Paste, and it doesn't work, you can always open your most recent file, and that's going to be the one. So we'll get this in, copy it, close, and we'll paste it in here. Perfect. Now, right now, this may look a little bit funny. This is just what I call a utility layer. It has no bearing. It's for placement only. We will not use it. We'll delete it when we're done. But here's what we're going to do with it. With this now applied and intact, top layer, if we go to the channels, now the channels are going to reflect that layer. So basically whatever's active in the layers will always be reflected in the channels. Let's load this as a selection, and I'll make a new channel out of it here. I'll deselect and we'll take a look. Well, that looks really good, except that I want it to be completely opposite, so let's invert it. Well, that looks really great. Look, we basically made a selection of the foreground, and now we just need to get rid of some of the background. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and select just the sky here. I'll find a bridge as an intersection point. Command M for curves, and what I'm going to do is try to clamp the area right around that tree. That's all I'm going to do. Just try to get rid of all of that. Make it very clean and very seamless. Perfect. That's exactly what I want. Now what we're going to have to do, though, is we're going to have to go in and clean some of this up. So I know that I want 100% this of this here to be shown through, because this is essentially going to be our mask for the blue hour scene. So why don't we clamp it just a little bit more? Just a little tiny bit more to get rid of some of those regions. And I'm going to go in with my brush, and I'm going to set my brush less of a soft edge here to 100% flow, and I'm just going to paint some of this in. So we'll paint everything in that we know needs to be there. Basically just everything here. Just like that. So this is basically just I call this sort of a broad stroke. So this is basically just going to be everything that we know we need to be there. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm either going to paint, see these little areas here, or I'm just going to start drawing with the lasso tool, and I'm going to get close to these edges. I'm not going to worry too much about some of this detail, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. Around these trees really isn't that important. But what I'm trying to do here is leave a lot of the anti-aliasing intact. If you're not familiar with what anti-aliasing means, it's actually what it's soft edges that are created around any image in Photoshop, especially around selections here. And it basically means that all of this will be an anti-aliased edge. So it won't really have a feather, it's just going to have feathers between pixels. So if you think about cutting pixels, it would just be a jagged line. Anti-aliasing creates feathered edges around pixels. So by doing this, I'm going to keep most of that intact. And I'm just using the lasso tool just to go around here just a little bit more, knowing that if I were to clamp this a little bit in the curves, then I'd lose some of that anti-aliasing that I really want to protect. I also know that since I've spent a lot of time blending what was underneath, I don't have to worry too much about this being perfect. I just want it to be pretty good. In fact, I'm going to make it almost good, like almost finished, just like this, just broad strokes. And then once I get it in onto the mask, I'm going to make some additional adjustments here. I'm not going to worry about anything around these trees. I'll get rid of that because I messed it up. But I'm just going to go ahead and do the base of these trees. Something like that. I'm going to flood it with white. Very simple. Not perfect yet, but what I'm going to do is go ahead and load this, go back to the layers. I'm going to create a new mask here by first creating a folder, creating a new mask, and where this is going to be Final Blend. So with the Final Blend, I'm going to go ahead and just throw this to the bottom because we don't need it right now. I'm going to zoom out so we can take a look at what's going to happen here. I'm going to put my Blue Hour blend inside of Final Blend, and you can see now we're starting to get something that's looking like a blend. So here we go. We've started to get the basics of blending in the Blue Hour with the background. So this is a great start, but we still have lots of cleanup to do to get this to be seamless. I just wanted to go ahead and throw this into the mask now so we can see how good it's already starting to look with minimal effort. Time to clean up that mask. So let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit, see what's happening here. You know, actually, to be honest, it doesn't even look bad, even though that was a bad edge. But we close in a little bit more on it, and now you're starting to see that edge. So it starts to look bad. But the cool thing is remember how we blended all of this in before? And we made it pretty similar in tonality now that this goes on top. You see how faint that edge is. So we did a really good job. It could have been 1 or 2% more, and it would have been perfect. It would have been seamless already. But I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and I encourage you guys to be a perfectionist as well, or in this case, perfectionists. Let's go ahead and let's clean this up. So again, I'm just going to use the lasso tool real quick because it's easy for me to do. It's lasso tool, lasso, and believe it or not, that is just a little window outside for the Vatican. And the other thing is we don't have the Vatican lit right now, which, you know, is kind of lame, but it's also good that they replaced it. So when you guys visit Rome, or if you have in the last few months, this was December when I shot it, you're going to get the best benefit of the nicest new lights on the Vatican. So it's definitely a good thing. I'm just not used to the Vatican lights being off, so it was a little disappointing for us. But we make do. So sometimes you have to just work with what you get, but we still came out with a really really nice sky. I'm not too concerned about these edges. I'm going to end up feathering these edges. So as a general rule, depending on how much you're planning on feathering, which is usually between 1/2 and 2 pixels, depending. If everything's sharp, then it's usually closer to 1/2 a pixel. Then you want to make sure that you always cut in from the edge. And that's what I'm really trying to do here. I always flood just to make sure I get everything. And I'm just going to do this a little bit more here. This is a cool method because it requires what's called cleanup. So imagine if we just went ahead and decided to commit to doing this type of selection. So in other words, we just said, you know what, I feel like I have a lot of time in my day today. I think I'm going to just use the lasso tool all day and paint a bunch of things out. Well, chances are it was going to take us much longer to do it, and our edges wouldn't be as good. So by clamping this channel, what we've done is we've done the hard work for us. The hard work is the edges. The easy work is this silly little cleanup that we have to do. And again, it's not super crucial. You know, even if I just go ahead and add this and I don't worry about those windows, nobody's really going to notice. We have a really nice advantage of being able to tease reality a little bit here and, you know, build something new for the viewer that they really haven't seen. So all this stuff here, chances are people aren't going to notice. We can always clean it up later. But I just want it to be nice and tidy first. And these areas, honestly, these are probably the more complex areas. And you can see I'm also using my stylus, so if I want, I can actually just freehand all these masks, just like this. And if I'm holding the Option key, as soon as I let go, it turns into the polygon lasso tool so I can reset. I'm using a small tablet right now. If I had a medium tablet, this would be a dream to work on right now. But the small still works really well. Perfect, perfect, not quite as perfect. Let's make it perfect. And let's just call this close enough for now. Great. What I can actually do here is I can go into the mask options. I just want to show you guys, I can watch what happens when I feather. That's too much. But if we do just a tiny, tiny little bit, 0.2, 0.5 pixels, it helps tremendously. We'll go ahead and zoom that out. We'll take a look at our result. Now we're starting to get that blending point right back in. Time to address some of the other negative issues. Take a look at the water, actually. Let's zoom in a little bit more. Take a look at that. Looks really, really bad. In fact, that's sort of a negative thing that you get if you blended all this together in HDR, because it would just basically eat up these values. So if I turn this mask on and off by holding Shift, you can see simply by blending in more of the blue hour here, I can fix all that. So that's really easy to do with the brush. And I don't even have to have it at full opacity. In this case, something 40 or 50% flow, I can just go ahead and softly brush all this water back in so that we lose all that sunset state here. We want to get these highlights back in. Here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. We want to be really careful around some of these edges. But for the most part, this area around here we know should be 100% in. 100% in here. Really nice. And now I'm going to do a 10%, and I'm just going to start to fade some of this out. Fade some of this out here. Here's what's really cool. If we take a look at this mask, you can see that it's including a lot of the blue hour. But what I want to do is start to bring some of these highlights back in. And the only way to do that is with a light-handed brush, and you do it manually. And then we can start to paint some of these highlights back in so they start to fade in to the sunset. So we want a little bit there. Even something like this may be better just to fade it out, so it's even less apparent, just like this. Because that light would just fade right in, fade right in. Same thing here. Heat up those reflections. Heat up these reflections here from the light. Fix them. It all looks pretty good, actually. Looks really good. And you guys have seen me do this so many times with the brush now. You can really see why I favor brushing, just because you get the nice soft edges. So that looks pretty good. That's going to be our blend. Now, something else I want to point out. Now, this is really annoying. Remember, I shot this on that little tabletop tripod, and watch it very closely. You can see that the pixels shift just a little bit. Now, it's not just because they move sort of a micropixel, but the lighting changes too. So sometimes it seems like they're shifting more than they do, but check out how the light changes over time. Since we have light coming from above from the light from the sky, and then we have light coming from below, which is illuminating everything, but still, it's pretty seamless. Now let's address a big issue with this type of blending, and that's edges. Edges are a problem. Now remember, I blended 2 separate scenes together, and over time, this is probably 20 or 30 minutes of time, trees move, wind changes, things change. So I'm using a blending a mask that's for the sunset with the blue hour inside of it, so chances are those trees are going to move. But here's the really cool thing. So I have my final blend. This is my working mask. What I'm going to do is put a mask on my blue hour, and I'm going to mask some of it out. So these trees, take a look at the before and after here. There's before blue hour, and here's with blue hour. They don't change a whole lot. So what I'm actually going to do is just brush some of it out. I'm just going to take a light brush, and I'm just going to paint out some of the trees, paint out some of that blue hour, and I'm going to minimize that artifacting around the edges. So basically all this, even those buildings there, none of this really needs to be blended in. Same thing with the trees. Any of the motion on the trees, check this out. See all that motion on the trees there? All I have to do is just blend it out, blend it all out. So we can just clean it up and blend it out. And it'll get rid of those gray edges. We'll go around here, we'll do the same around these trees, and that makes the edges a little less crucial. That antenna does not have to have it. I wouldn't recommend painting out the Vatican. I'll show you why. You can see that it's going to turn blue because it's going to have the ambient light. Leave that intact, but just go ahead and go over here, clean up some of these things that don't matter. You can see I undid that one. But trees are trees. So any of the tree edges that didn't line up, we can just go ahead and paint out. I'm going right around the edges here, but you can see how that's cleaning that up, getting rid of any seams, back it out a little bit, and now you can see my blending zones there. So I'm just going to go ahead and softly blend out some more. Here, just softly blend it out into here. So it seems seamless here. Seamless, seamless, seamless. That all looks pretty good. All right, back it up one more time. What we need to do is take a look at our blend one more time. So we have our sunset and our sunset blended with blue hour. Now we just need to do a little bit more to clean all this up. So far, edges look good. What I want to do though now is, since I decided to pick 2 very extreme points of day, if you want to blend, if you want an easy blend, pick something that's so close to blue hour that it looks similar. If you want to do something very challenging, pick something way before. Try something with some blue in the sky, or try to blend a blue hour with the sun in the sky, which can be very difficult too. But it's still doable. You just have to be very careful in the blending. And after you blend everything together seamlessly, then you have to start adjusting some of the lighting. So right now what I want to do is adjust. I think the sky is a little bit too bright. The sky has to come down in tonality to match the brightness of the foreground, because right now that brightness would take away from the lighting in the foreground. And I chose a very late blue hour, so we have to address this. So now, before we start doing anything else, basically between our sunset and blue hour, I want to go ahead and create a curves layer. And with that curves layer, since it's pretty easy to do, what I'm going to do is just start bringing down the sky a little bit. So I'm going to bring down the values here. I'm going to pull this dot all the way down to the shadows. I'm going to bring those down a little bit. And I'm going to add contrast by pulling it up. So it's basically just going to pre-darken the sky just a little bit, just to add a little bit more contrast. What I might also do here inside of the blue hour, since this is all put together, this is really nice. Basically anything I put inside of this mask will be color correction. I'm going to create another curves. And my shadows, I feel, are a little clipped. If I want to basically reduce the imprint of the shadows, I can actually destroy it by doing this. But if I just pick this up, maybe just 1 pixel or a few little pixels, then it's actually just going to take the contrast in the darks down a little bit. And that's just going to pull the blend to an easier state. So basically what I'm doing is just trying to clean these few things up. So basically that brings the sky down. You can see that I have some overlap in the trees, which is perfectly fine. So the next thing I want to do while I'm on that subject is, with our final blend, I want to address an issue here. Now we have a very, very warm sky, but we have very cool areas around the roofs, around the trees, and around the Vatican dome. So what I want to do is I actually want to color correct this area, these cool areas, to be a little bit warmer in the sky. And I can do that inside of this mask very easily. And the way that I do that is just to create another curves layer. And actually I can do this two different ways. If you prefer to use curves, you can use curves, or you can use a photo filter. In this case, I can counteract the cool filter by adding a warming filter. And you can see if I turn this on, you can see that it's going to warm up the cupola there, and it's going to warm up everything else. Right now, let me just go ahead and zoom focus right into here, and you can see that I'm starting to neutralize some of that cool tone by adding some warm tone. So from here, I can black out the mask, select a paintbrush. I'll just go ahead and zoom out, make it easy, and what I can do is just softly paint in some warmth here. So just adding warmth to where it was cold. Here too, adding some warmth where it was cold. And basically what that'll do is it'll warm these trees up and make it seem as though they were lit by this type of sky rather than cooler blue hour sky. And that's a very easy thing to do. Very simple, simple blend. I call this blending, I don't call it compositing, but it does share some similarities to what matte painters do in the CG world. And that's really, bringing a bunch of things in that don't match and making them match. The difference is we actually shot all these at the same place, so technically they do match, we're just trying to color correct them back to original. So that looks pretty good so far. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to make this a bigger nested composition here. We have our final blend, we have everything, and then I'm just going to take everything here except for that original raw, and I'm just going to put it all together and we'll call it the big blend. That sounds pretty good. Next step is to go ahead and address some of the global color correction. Now that we've color corrected just for the in-between to get the blending right, now it's time to color correct and unify everything together. So remember, after we do the blending, we do additional color correction to unify those things together. Before I do that, I just want to make sure that there was nothing that I needed to clean up. I'm going to create a new layer here, and I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to see. I know that my Nikon D810 was much dirtier, but I have some of these little birds here, so let's just go ahead and clean up anything silly. I don't anticipate there being much cleanup here, or very many things to have to clean up in the sky, but you always want to comb through. Do it now is always better than later, just in case. So we'll even go down here into the water. This is a good time to say, well, you know what, I don't like some of these reflections, or this is Rome, there's a bunch of dirt, or there's people under here, or anything like that. It's also something interesting. You see this line that's going across? I'm not going to spend the time to get rid of it, but in fact, I usually leave it here because it's sort of a mooring line. But in some cases, if I had more time or I really wanted to be a perfectionist, I could go ahead and paint those things out. But really, this is your chance to just get rid of anything that you think shouldn't be there. And in this case, it all looks pretty good. There's just one bird, which is surprising for Rome. So now that we've done that, what I want to show you guys now, I'm going to avoid using any plugins. We're not going to use On1, we're not going to use Nik. We're not going to use Nik Collection On1, or basically anything except for a high-pass filter. What I want to do is go ahead and create some dynamic contrast using a simple technique with luminosity masking. And we're going to create a luminosity mask for midtones. So check this out. It's actually really easy to do. Don't let anybody let you think that it's extremely complex. Let's create a brand new one so we can take a look at this. I'm just going to Command-click everything and create an alpha channel. Command-D to deselect the crawling ant. So right now, look, we have highlights, shadows. That's pretty self-explanatory, right? So let's just duplicate this one real quick. Let's duplicate it so that we have highlights and shadows. I have two separate masks. Well, what do you think midtones are? Midtones are everything that is between, right? In the middle, then you have highlights here, you have shadows here. So how do we just select what's in between these two things? Well, what we can do is Command-A to select all, and then we have everything selected. And what we can do is we can subtract one of these. So it says alpha 3, we know that this is the highlights. I'll subtract the highlights. And now I'll subtract the shadows. It's going to tell me that no pixels more than 50% selected, edges will not be visible, which is fine. We'll go ahead and create a new mask. And check this out. So now I have just the midtones. I basically have a layer, a selection that has subtracted both the highlights and the shadows to give me this midtone layer. It's very easy. So I'm going to load this, and it's going to give me that no pixels are selected error, which is fine. And I'm going to create a curves layer. With the curves layer, you can see that it doesn't show you anything, but basically, essentially what I've selected are the midtones. Highlights and shadows are protected. So if I add contrast to this, check this out. What I'm actually going to be doing is just changing the midtones. If I clamp this, I just want to show you guys how extreme this is. You can see that it's going to protect all those highlights, all those shadows, and this gives me a mid-tone mask. So a lot of the stuff that we've been doing with the detail enhancement in both On1, in Nik Collection has all been based on just affecting the midtones and the quarter tones. And what I've done now is created a mask that I can select and manipulate just those midtones. So this is pretty cool. So watch this. This is how you create contrast in the midtones. So what I'm going to do is make the shadows darker and the highlights more vibrant. And that's going to create what's called, I call it dynamic contrast. Dynamic contrast just in the midtones so we protect all the other values. And we can tune this until we get it to look exactly how we want. And you can see the before and the after. And now we've created some nice dynamic contrast. We'll go ahead and leave this sort of neutral for now because we can go ahead and name it and we can adjust it a little bit more later. So we'll call this Midtone Luma Mask. Right now, I really like the way this looks. It's a little extreme, but it's an awesome sky. And when I say awesome sky, I mean that it's a layered sky. I'm always looking for this kind of layer and texture in my skies. I don't really like the contrail here. That's something I might clone out. But again, you know, it is Rome. It's very busy. And people sort of excuse it for these kind of areas. If you're just in the middle of nowhere that looks like an alien world, then I'd say get rid of the contrail because it can take you out of the environment. Here it's okay, and it's actually a nice white streak. But what I feel is that the whole thing here is a little bit too warm. The sky's a little bit too warm and everything, and what I want to do is cool that off a little bit. But I don't want to have to make a complex selection to do so, and I don't want to rely on my Nik collection. I want to do this manually. So let's go ahead and take a look at our channels. And we have a lot here that we've already made, but if we take a specific look at RGB, I'll go ahead and turn these off so that we can have one selected. Sorry, here, one. We'll start with red and then RGB. The cool thing is, if we look at this, if we know that there's a lot of blue in the top of the sky. So we know that there's a lot of blue selected here. We know that green is sort of a mixture color between what we have predominantly as red and yellows and predominant in blue in the sky. But if we take a look at the red, check this out. You can see that most of what's selected here already is all of that red in the sky. Where in blue, you can see that most of what's selected is that neutral blue color, and that most of the red here becomes sort of dark. So combinations of all these channels can be used, and we can use them for quick color correction. So that works out really well. So here's a good example. Like say we want to take these reds in here and we want to cool them down. What we can do is we can create a specific folder. We're going to go ahead and select the reds. I'm going to go back to layers and I'm going to create a new folder, apply this mask, and I'm going to call it Red Luma. Here's the cool thing. Like we basically have a way now. We want to change the colors. We want to cool down the sky a little bit. Maybe we want to add more or less contrast to the foreground. We want to bring all this together. We want to pop the color here in these reflections. The great thing is we haven't manipulated this, but we spent a lot of time creating some custom masks. So if I go back into my blend, I already have my final blend, which actually, if we take a look at it, pretty much is the foreground and the background. Or in this case, it's the sky and it's the water, or it's the foreground. So what I can actually do is load this again, and I can create another masking thing here. I can go ahead and create another folder, and I'm going to create this folder with the mask, and I'm going to call it the foreground. And what I'm going to do is select this again, and I'm going to invert it, so Command-Shift-I for invert, and I'll create another folder, and we'll call this background, or in this case, sky. So anything I put in this folder will only affect the sky. Anything I put in this folder will only affect the foreground. So here's what's really cool. If I say create a curves. Inside the curves layer now in the sky, I can basically change the brightness and everything. Now, that looks horrible, but I can change the brightness, contrast, and everything of just the sky and not affect this area in the foreground whatsoever. So that lets me do some very cool things. I could increase the red overall, or I can change the tonality altogether. So let's say I can do this. So the first thing that I want to do is go ahead and change the blue. So I want to cool down this sky. What I'm going to do is just go ahead and cool down the sky just by pulling this blue over. So you can see if I go too far, we create purples. Purples aren't a bad thing. This is a little bit too much. But if I just pull this over a little tiny bit, I'm going to go ahead and cool down those values of the sky, and I'm going to get more crisp blue in there. The second thing that I can do in the RGB very quickly is I can go ahead and clamp that a little bit just so I get more intensity back here. That's what I wanted, just a little bit more intensity to put back. Let's go ahead and shelf that for a minute. The next thing I can do is actually go in, create another curves layer, and let's put some of that red back. So let's really concentrate on this area. If I pull the red over, you can see that I can create more red. And this is kind of cool too, if I mess with the green a little bit, I can make that an orange color instead of a red. Going back to the blue, if I pull the blue down, you can see that that's going to make it an even more intense color. So see this? It's going to turn it into a yellow. So what I can actually do, just with some simple adjustments here with the RGB, I can actually change the sky from this to this. It's going to create more color and a little bit more luminosity here in the reds. I'm going to take that one step further just by adding a little bit more red to the sky. And here's what I'm going to do. I don't want this to be throughout. I created this layer to cool down the sky, created this layer to warm up the sky, but I only want it down here in these bottom clouds. So what I'll do is I'll select the gradient tool and I'll just go ahead and paint so that it fades out to about this point here. So at the base here I get these nice reds. The cool thing is I've also added these reds back in to the reflection, because you can see that that's part of that mask as well. So that's a really easy thing to do. So we worked on the sky a little bit. Let's jump to the foreground or our architecture layer here, and I'm going to create another curves. So remember, I have this contrast that unifies it all back together, but what I can do is just start to make some subtle changes here to the brightness, just some small tweaks. And I can also maybe even do the same thing that I did before and cool some of this down. What would happen if I cooled some of this down? Well, it's going to clean it a little bit. I don't want to cool too much of it down. I think I'm actually going to leave it intact. I'm just going to go ahead and work a little bit on this RGB. So I like to soften a little bit of that contrast throughout while protecting those highlights. It makes it a very simple thing to do. Now, another thing that I can do, let's go ahead and take this entire blending layer. I'm going to do that super hotkey Shift Option Command E. It's going to create a new layer. That's the entire big blend result, which is fine. It can look like this. It doesn't matter. What I'm actually going to do is create a high pass. And we're going to say 2 pixels. Set this to overlay. And here's the cool thing about this. I already have a mask for the foreground, so I don't have to worry about it affecting the sky. And if I zoom in, you can see that now I get the high pass just on the foreground elements. And that's very powerful because I won't get any haloing at all. The only thing I'm going to have to do is create a mask here. Remember, we don't want to sharpen any of the water because that sharpens the artifacts in the water. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and show the, let's see, make sure that I select the brush here, and I'll just go ahead and paint it out while showing the quick mask. I don't have to worry about the top. The top's already taken care of. I just don't want all this to be sharp. I want that to be soft. But now I have the high pass filter that lives inside of the foreground layer. Now we can go back to the sky. We can make some other small tweaks. It's pretty nice. So we already have these curves here that are popping up the reds. You know what I might want to do in the RGB as well is actually drop the contrast just a little tiny bit to really cook those reds. Pull the highlights up a little bit just to give it a little bit more contrast. I'll go back into the red channel and I may even add just a little bit more intensity to those reds there. So it gives it some nice tonality. The curves here is global. That looks pretty good. The curves on top of here adds a little bit more personality back in there. Might be a hair too much. Let's go ahead and pull that back down a little bit. This is where it gets a little bit more crucial as far as what you have to do. All that looks pretty good. We have a sharp foreground, blended foreground, and now let's go ahead and tweak that midtone again. So this is kind of cool. So what I've done is I've basically blended each area separately, and then I've created a unifying blend, not a unifying blend, sorry, a unifying correction on top. So this will help pull it all together. So now I can go ahead and really pull these midtones down and create something that's extremely dynamic. Protects the shadows that I already tweaked and the highlights. That looks really good. It's about this time that we should take a look at the histogram. I'll look here in the histogram. We have a little bit of clipping here. Most of that clipping is going to be occurring in these lights, but even here, that may be getting close to a little bit blown out, but remember we have color corrections on the sky. So if anything looks a little odd, say in these curves that we did here, just for the color, I have a couple choices. I can either go into the curves there and make some changes to the curves, or I can just paint out the areas really quickly that I don't want it to be as intense. But in this case, I'll just go back to the RGB. I'll unclamp that little bit of RGB that I added just so that it pulls it back down a little bit. Doesn't make it so blown out. We'll keep that really clean and really easy. So here we go. This layer, this was our utility layer. I'm going to go ahead and throw that away. I'm going to save this just in case Photoshop decides to crash. And let's go ahead and take a look at what we've done, because we've really created something extraordinary here. Now remember, when you're working with moments in time, you have more of an opportunity to create something truly unique. In fact, chances are nobody will ever see a combination of these elements together. Most of the time when you're standing in the same place, even if you're there with a bunch of other photographers, even though we talked about how the parallax shifts a little bit from side to side, we're still going to have the opportunity to capture something very similar to what they had. But by blending time together, we're able to create a super moment, a moment that represents an entire memory of this event unfolding. So this is what I remember, all the colors, everything in the scene, the colors of the sky mixing with the colors in the foreground, the colors from the Vatican, even the not so much colors and light from the roof of the Vatican. But this is what I remember as an entire event. So we're able to put this all together and give people that something truly unique and something they'll never see again before. And even if you try to repeat it, it won't come out the same the second time. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we've done. We've gone a long way here. So let's go ahead and turn off the color corrections that we've done. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our original raw, which is here. And our original raw went from here all the way to here. If we look at it again in stages, we have our original raw. I'll go ahead and turn all these off. Our blend of sunset, which is already a very beautiful image. And then we have our blue hour added in, and then a little bit of cleanup, there wasn't much. And then check out the color corrections that we've done just with 3 simple steps. And it looks really good. Now it's really starting to come alive. We can just make any more tweaks that we want, any more tweaks to the values and the midtones, and we have ourselves a very unique and very beautiful image as a result. Well, that wraps it up for this lesson. I'm really excited because this is the second time that we've been able to blend moments in time together in Italy. The first time was in Vernazza. It was pretty awesome, but it was much easier. This one was much more complex. We had to use a lot of different masking techniques, but as you can see, even though they sound complicated or they seem complicated, if you just follow these simple steps, you'll see that it's easy and you'll end up with a very seamless blend. So I encourage you to take these files, practice with them so that when you're in Rome or you're any other part of the world that's going to have this lighting event, you're ready to capture everything you need and you're going to be able to put it all together yourself.